Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today, we're doing things a little differently.
Oh.
Yeah, we're time traveling, well, sort of.
Time travel.
Haha, yeah. We're going to be looking back at global trends and events from 2024.
Okay.
Yeah, so think of it as like a little glimpse into the recent past.
I like it.
Yeah, and our source for all of this is an episode from the pretty popular podcast, Smartpodcast.
Okay.
Yeah, you know that one.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, they did a whole episode on what the big things were back in 24.
That's cool. It's actually really interesting to see, how some things that seem like a really big deal back then are barely even a thing now. And then other trends, well, they've really stuck around.
Right. It really makes you think like, wow, maybe the future really is closer than we think.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, so Smart Podcast covered a lot of ground in this episode. We're talking everything from the impact of climate change in Pakistan.
Oh, wow.
To something that's actually pretty hopeful, Pakistan's solar energy boom, and even those fun viral TikTok trends that were going around.
Oh, yeah, I remember those.
Right. Who knew those little videos could be so insightful?
Well, they are kind of like a cultural barometer, aren't they?
Yeah.
You can really learn a lot about what people are thinking about and, feeling by what goes viral.
Totally. Okay, so let's kick things off with that climate change story. So Smart Podcast talked about how the devastating floods that hit Pakistan in 2024, specifically in the Sindh region.
Right.
Yeah, those floods were linked to a rise in forced marriages.
Yeah, that is a tragic example of how climate disasters can have these ripple effects that impact something as basic as human rights.
I know, it's awful.
Imagine families are facing such incredible hardship that they feel like the only option they have is to marry off their young daughters just for survival.
It's just heartbreaking.
It really is, and it just makes you think about that human cost of climate change, right?
It really does.
And it goes way beyond just the immediate crisis.
For sure.
Smart Podcast was emphasizing how important it is to have long-term support to help families rebuild their lives. Otherwise, it's like they just get stuck in this cycle of vulnerability.
Right, exactly. It's about going beyond just the immediate relief and really investing in solutions that build resilience to climate change.
Right, like drought-resistant crops, early warning systems for floods, and helping people find ways to, diversify how they earn a living.
Okay, so let's switch gears now and talk about that solar energy boom in Pakistan.
Okay.
This one honestly blew me away.
Really?
Yeah, so they imported something like 25 gigawatts worth of solar panels that year.
Wow.
I know, right? And most of them came from China, by the way.
Okay.
And get this, that boosted their power supply by 50%.
That's remarkable.
I know. What I thought was really interesting is that this wasn't some big government program or anything.
Right.
It was mostly driven by individuals and communities doing it themselves.
Wow.
Yeah, electricity costs in Pakistan have been skyrocketing, and the power grid is super unreliable.
Yeah, I've heard that.
So people just started investing in rooftop solar panels on their own because it was just the most practical and affordable option.
That's amazing. Makes you wonder if other developing countries could do the same thing.
Right. Could this be a blueprint for a more decentralized, sustainable energy future?
It's possible. I think what's so exciting is that it really puts power in the hands of local communities. It's not about depending on these huge power plants or expensive infrastructure.
Right.
It's about people being in control of their own energy.
Exactly. Okay, so let's dive into public health now. Smart Podcast also highlighted Pakistan's fight against polio.
Okay.
They had a massive vaccination campaign. Back in 24, they were trying to reach something like 45 million children.
Wow, 45 million.
I know. But even with a campaign that huge, Smart Podcast was saying it was still incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
There were areas where healthcare workers were facing resistance, even threats, from some communities that didn't trust the vaccine.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's tough. It really shows you how public health isn't just about logistics,
Right.
It's also about building trust and communication.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you imagine the courage it takes for those healthcare workers to go into these communities knowing they might be met with hostility?
Yeah.
And all to protect children from this debilitating disease. It's incredible.
Totally. They're like the unsung heroes out there.
Absolutely. And if they manage to eradicate polio, that would be a huge achievement, not just for Pakistan, but for global health as a whole.
For sure.
Okay, so are you ready for something a little lighter?
Always.
All right, let's take a little detour into TikTok land. Smart Podcast was talking about this trend where people were using AI effects to transform themselves into Disney and Pixar characters.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Do you remember that hashtag eFeedo3?
Yes, it was everywhere.
It was. I know.
It's amazing how technology like AI is becoming so easy to use, right? Even just a smartphone filter can create these super realistic transformations.
It's wild. And it shows how connected we all are globally.
Right.
Like a trend can take off in one part of the world and boom, it's everywhere in just days.
Makes you wonder what trends we see now, even if they seem small, might end up being those game changers later on.
Oh, totally. That's what's so exciting. You never know.
Exactly.
Okay, last stop on our Smart Podcast tour. They spent some time talking about Google's year in search for 2024.
Okay.
And no big surprise, major sporting events were up there, like Copa America and the UEFA Euro.
Yeah, those always grab everyone's attention.
Right. Those huge tournaments always capture the whole world's attention.
It's interesting, though, that Copa America was the top search.
Really?
Yeah. Makes you think maybe there's a growing interest in South American football, right? It could be because of new, younger stars.
Yeah.
Or just a shift in who people are following globally. Something to watch, for sure.
For sure. They also mentioned that Donald Trump was a top search term. Which, I guess isn't that surprising?
No, not really.
Like political figures, just like those sports stars, they really dominate the global conversation.
Right.
What do you think was driving that surge in interest in Trump, though?
Well, remember, 2024 was a presidential election year in the U.S.
Right.
And Trump was making a lot of noise about maybe running again.
True.
Plus, there were all those legal issues and investigations going on.
Yeah, it was hard to miss.
It really was. It was all over the news everywhere, so people were definitely looking for info.
It makes sense. And then, amidst all the sports and politics, Smartpodcast mentioned that Inside Out 2 was a top search, too.
Oh, I love that movie.
Me too. It seems like even with everything else going on, people still crave a bit of lighthearted escapism.
Oh, absolutely. It just shows that even with all the crazy stuff happening in the world, people still connect with those stories that speak to their emotions.
Right.
Especially stories that help us make sense of our own feelings and experiences,
Totally. So we've got a real mix of trends here. Climate change, social media, public health, political drama. What stands out to you from this little snapshot of 2024?
That's tough. I think what's really striking is that contrast you mentioned earlier between the challenges and opportunities the world was facing.
It's a lot.
It is. We see the devastation from climate change, but also this amazing ingenuity of people finding solutions.
Like with those embracing solar energy in Pakistan.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even when we're dealing with serious global issues, there's still hope, there's innovation, and a ton of human resilience.
Absolutely.
Oh, and of course, we can't forget a good dose of fun and escapism, too.
Definitely not.
But I'm curious, were there any specific details from Smart Podcasts that really stuck with you?
There was one thing about the solar panels in Pakistan. That was really interesting to me. Smart Podcast mentioned that most of those panels were actually financed through microloans.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, so it wasn't just like wealthy people or big companies making the switch.
Right.
Everyday people could afford to get involved.
That's amazing. It really makes renewable energy accessible to everyone.
Exactly. That's what's so cool about what happened in Pakistan. It wasn't some top-down government program. It was about giving individuals and communities the power to take control of their own energy.
It was like a grassroots energy revolution.
Just like that. A grassroots energy revolution. And it had all these other effects, too.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, Smart Podcast said that as the demand for solar panels went up, Pakistan actually had to change its import rules.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they had to make it easier for foreign companies to do business there. Mostly companies from China, actually.
So it wasn't just about the technology itself.
Right.
They had to change the rules to encourage innovation and investment.
Exactly. And that, of course, created jobs and helped boost the local economy.
So it was a win-win situation.
Pretty much.
Okay, I want to go back to that polio vaccination campaign for a second.
Okay.
It's easy to focus on those huge numbers, like 45 million children.
Right.
But it's important to remember that behind each of those vaccinations, there's a real story.
Absolutely. Smart Podcast shared this story about a healthcare worker in a rural village.
Okay.
And she had to go door to door talking to families and explaining why the vaccine was so important.
Wow.
And there were all these myths and rumors going around, so she had to patiently debunk those too.
It must have been really tough.
Yeah, it took a lot of time and effort, but she managed to convince most of the families to vaccinate their kids.
That's amazing. Talk about dedication.
Yeah, it really shows you what those healthcare workers were up against.
They were doing such important work.
Absolutely. It was a massive effort with thousands of people working all over the country, often in really difficult situations.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, but they knew how important it was. Polio can be devastating, especially for children.
You're right. It makes you realize the impact they were having.
Yeah. And, thinking about that TikTok trend with the Disney characters, it might seem kind of silly.
Oh, yeah.
But it actually made me think about our need to feel like we belong, like we're part of something bigger.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that.
Well, think about it. people were using AI to transform themselves into these characters that everyone loves.
Right.
It's like they're entering this world of shared stories and imagination.
And sharing it with millions of other people around the world.
Exactly. It's like a new kind of digital storytelling.
Like a modern fairy tale.
That's a great way to put it. And those fairy tales, they tap into something universal.
Mm-hmm.
They help us understand the world and our emotions and find our place in a community,
Yeah.
even if that community exists online.
It's so true. And it's not just about escaping reality either.
Right.
It also shows you how creative people can be with AI.
It's giving them tools to express themselves in ways they couldn't before.
And those tools are just going to get more powerful.
Exactly. It makes you wonder what people will create in the future.
It's exciting to think about. Okay, let's go back to Google's year in search for a minute.
Okay.
I thought it was fascinating that Copa America was the top search globally.
Yeah, me too.
It's a major sporting event, sure. But it really feels like it points to this growing global interest in South American football.
I think so too. And Smartpodcast was talking about how this new generation of really talented players is coming up from countries like Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay.
Those are powerhouse teams.
They are. And those players are capturing people's imaginations all over the world.
Just like Messi and Ronaldo did before.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder if the balance of power in football is shifting.
Totally.
Could South America become the dominant force again?
It would definitely be exciting to see.
I know. Okay, and I have to admit, I wasn't surprised at all to see Donald Trump as a top search term.
He does know how to stay in the spotlight.
He really does. He was constantly in the news in 2024.
It's true. There was all that talk about him running for president again, plus the investigations into his businesses, and he was always criticizing the Biden administration.
It was a lot.
It was all over the news and nationally, so of course people were searching for info.
Makes sense. It's hard to ignore someone like him.
It really is.
Okay, I want to go back to Inside Out 2 for a second.
Okay, one of my favorites.
Mine too. It's just a movie, but it says a lot about how fascinated we are with emotion.
I think so too. The first Inside Out was such a game changer.
I know.
Because it gave us a way to talk about our feelings.
Yeah, it made it okay to talk about how you feel.
Exactly, and the sequel explored those ideas even more.
Like how?
Well, it looked at growing up, dealing with change, and all the complicated emotions teenagers go through.
Right.
It makes sense that it would resonate with people all over the world. We all go through those things.
Exactly. They're universal experiences.
They are, and they're not things we always talk about openly.
It's true.
But a movie like Inside Out 2 gives us permission to talk about it.
Right.
It creates a space where we can explore our feelings and connect with others who are going through the same things.
It makes you feel seen, you know?
Exactly, and who doesn't need that?
So as we wrap up this deep dive into 2024, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to think about? What's that thought-provoking question you'd like to leave them with?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing to remember is... That's a great question. I think the most important thing to remember is that we're all part of this like giant global system.
Okay.
And what happens in one place can ripple out and have these huge effects we might not even think about.
That's a good point.
Yeah, like those solar panels in Pakistan, people deciding to invest in clean energy ended up changing government policy. It impacted international trade, even the whole global energy scene.
That's crazy. Our actions really can have a much better impact than we realize.
Exactly. It's like that butterfly effect, but on a global scale.
Totally.
So that brings me to the question I want to leave our listeners with.
Okay, sure.
What's happening right now that seems small, but could actually have huge implications down the road? What should we be paying attention to? What choices can we make, by ourselves and together to make a better future?
Those are big questions. It's like you're challenging all our listeners to be deep divers themselves.
I guess I am. It's not enough to just watch these trends happen.
Right.
We got to think about them, engage with them, and see how they might play out in the future.
We have to be active participants.
Exactly. Because the future isn't set in stone. We create it through our choices, our actions, even what we do online.
It's all connected.
It really is. So what about you? What are you watching closely these days? What trends are you keeping an eye on?
Well, AI is one that's really got my attention.
Oh yeah, AI is everywhere.
I know. It's changing everything. Entertainment, healthcare, how we produce energy.
And we're really just getting started.
Exactly. But I do think there are some big ethical questions we need to be asking.
For sure.
Like, how do we make sure AI is developed and used responsibly? How do we avoid those unintended consequences?
Those are huge questions we need to be thinking about right now.
Absolutely. Because like it or not, AI is going to impact our lives in a big way.
No doubt about it. I'm also really interested to see how things shift in terms of global power dynamics.
Yeah, me too. We talked about how China is becoming more influential, especially with renewable energy. But there are other countries rising up too.
Oh, definitely. The whole geopolitical landscape is changing all the time.
It is. And we have to pay attention to that because those power shifts affect everything.
From trade deals to climate change to, international security.
It's a lot to keep up with.
It is, but that's what makes it so interesting.
right? It's like we're always learning, trying to adapt, trying to make sense of the world as it changes faster and faster.
I love it. The world is such a complex, fascinating place. And the more we understand it, the better we'll be at dealing with whatever comes next.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So here we are, end of our deep dive into 2024.
It flew by.
I know, right? It's been a whirlwind tour, but I hope you all enjoyed it.
It's been a great exploring all this with you.
Likewise. And remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more out there to learn and to discover.
Keep asking those questions, dig a little deeper, and don't be afraid to dive in.
Until next time, stay curious, everyone.